welcome to the April 22nd, 2024 City Council Work Session. Happy Earth Day.
Yay.
Thank you for joining us in this hybrid meeting format for work sessions like this one, where there is no opportunity for public comment. Wishing to access the meeting, can do so by watching the live stream available on our website, the broadcast on Comcast Channel 21, or by calling into one of the phone numbers listed for this meeting on the public webcast and meeting materials webpage. Thank you again for joining us. I now call this work session to order, and I will turn it right over to the city manager.
Thank you, Mayor. That was kind of mean to remind us it's Earth Day since we're going to spend the rest of the night indoors. That's okay. I'm looking forward to tonight's conversation. I always appreciate when we have 90 minutes to kind of dig into something and make sure everybody has time to say what they need to. Tonight, we're going to talk about our finance and revenue journey. And I'm joined at the table with Twyla Miller, our CFO, and Matt Rodriguez, our assistant city manager. We're going to kind of not necessarily tag team it. I'm going to make some introductory comments and then they'll go on. But I would say this felt like, as I was preparing tonight, thinking about this long journey we've been on together, and you'll get a feel for that in some of Twyla's slides, which are going to show over a decade of some of the things we've been trying to solve as we've worked together, I think, pretty tirelessly to try to continuously be responsible stewards of the public's resources, continuously trying to deliver excellent, dependable services, and also work towards our goal of a sustainable budget. Most recently, as we were emerging out of COVID, I think we've taken some really excellent steps towards that sort of efficiency in shifting the way we budget, talking to the community about the things they continue to need, and developing a strategic plan that really addresses that. And one of those goals in the strategic plan is sustainable budget. So you've been pretty consistent. I think my entire career, it seems like we've been talking about how to get there.
Base camp.
So tonight, Twyla is going to revisit a bit of the gap and how, what the problem we're trying to solve, but we are going to shift more tonight to revenue solutions. So I wanted to just say a couple of things about that. The first is we're not going to dive deeply into the work of the revenue advisors, but I do want to remind everyone that we prepared a report last fall for you, a staff report on revenue options that had about 43 potential items in there. And this group of community members, we went through that long list of items and all the things, and they kind of narrowed down to about a dozen that they were most interested in learning more about and trying to determine how it would best solve our issues. So tonight, we're actually going to narrow down to even just like one or two of those and start to talk about fees. And that was one of the things that popped up in that could make sense to solve our short-term gap, because we're really going to focus on that tonight. And anytime we talk about fees, it feels like the very next question out of people's mouths is eWeb going to bill for this? And so I wanted to take a second before we dive into the details to just talk about why that's so. And we tend to go to that conversation because eWeb has been our utility biller for as long as I can remember. I don't know if we've ever billed for ourselves. They always have been. A lot of cities have their own billing capability. And so when we start talking about fees or utilities, it shifts the conversation there. But that's a partnership we've worked really hard on having be a good, strong partnership. And so we're not assuming anything here. They know we're having this conversation, but depending on how this conversation goes tonight, my plan is hopefully to get to them in early June to talk to them directly, to their Board of County Commission. I mean, not Board of County Commissioners. It's too many boards. Another board, that board, the eWeb board, about what we're doing, and just be really open and thoughtful about how we move forward in a way that supports a continued strong partnership. So with that, I'll pass it over to Twyla.
Thank you. So good evening, Twyla Miller, your CFO. And as Sarah said, we'll walk through some of the walk through our gap and focus on our critical gap. And Matt will talk a little bit about solutions, and we're here to answer questions and get your feedback. So some of the slides you'll see here tonight you've seen before, and we have a few new ones as well. So we do have an ongoing structural gap in our general fund where expenditures are growing at a faster pace than revenues. Our 2023-2025 adopted budget contained $25 million in budget strategies to address our structural gap, and we repurposed over $5 million in existing funding to make additional investments in downtown, unhoused, and alternate response programs. Even with these efforts, a structural gap remained, and an $8.3 million revenue placeholder was in the second year of the biennium was included in our adopted budget, as we knew we had to do additional work to evaluate revenues and think about additional budget strategies as we come into the summer. In December, when we brought the supplemental budget to you, the gap had grown from $8.3 million to $10.5 million. Additional modeling at that time showed the gap could grow from up to almost $16 million in that time period. And that was due to higher inflation and higher personnel costs in the out years of the forecast. Our current forecast shows our gap has increased from that time to $13.9 million over the next 2 years. We've updated our forecast to include updated estimates for revenues and expenditures this biennium as part of a mid-biennium fund review. Cost expenditures have also increased due to inflation lagging high and higher personnel costs. For example, we've updated the forecast to include our PERS advisory rates that we received in late December. And we've also incorporated higher PERS rates in relation to the legislation that was passed this past legislative session. The immediate gap remains at $8.3 million starting in FY25, which begins this July, and an additional $5.6 million as we look to the next biennium, FY26, which will begin in July of 2025. I will note that by placing funds into our reserve as part of your December supplemental budget, we're able to maintain our current problem that we're solving in this biennium at 8.3, and the remaining cost load shifted to the next biennium to solve. So this slide shows general fund revenues over the last 5 years. Property taxes, EWEB contribution in lieu of taxes, or SILT, and service charges are the top 3 revenue sources in our general fund. These 3 revenue types account for approximately 85% of general fund revenues, with property taxes representing the largest share by far at 71%. The table on the right shows the actual average annual growth of these revenue types over 5 fiscal years from fiscal year 19 through 23. You'll see that property tax revenue growth is driven by constitutional limitations of Oregon's property tax system, and so that's capped at about 4%. SILT revenue is driven by the price of electricity and how much is consumed. EWEB minimized electric price increases during this time, combined with warmer winter weather and pandemic impacts, which resulted in a 5-year average of no SILT revenue growth for the city, so that remained flat. And then we had negative growth in service charges during this time period, and that really is related to pandemic pressures and closures. The bottom row of the table shows that the annual average growth rate across all revenue types in the general fund over these 5 years is just 2.6% overall. When we look at the expenditure side, we see that personnel is the largest category at 75% of total expenditures. It takes people to deliver the service we deliver to our community. The table on the right again shows the average annual growth of general fund expenses over the same 5 fiscal years from FY19 through FY23. This data represents the funds that were spent over this time frame, so actual expenditures. Personnel expenses generally grow faster than materials and services due to cost increases above typical inflation, such as retirement costs and healthcare. Non-departmental expenses are primarily made up of transfers out to other funds, and the higher growth rate you see in this time period really reflects general fund support to other funds during the pandemic period. The average annual growth rate across all expenses in the general fund over these 5 years was 3%, which reflects a lot of effort to cut costs and increase efficiencies over this time period. Even with a high degree of fiscal stewardship, the growth in expenses exceeded the average revenue growth of just 2.6% over the same time frame. This imbalance is generally managed by drawing down reserves, which makes it difficult to add ongoing services or to build up reserves to weather unanticipated events. The average annual expense growth rate of 3% excludes expenditures of one-time ARPA funds, state homelessness response funds, and opioid settlement funds in order to compare and give an apples-to-apple comparison between revenues and expenditures. However, these one-time dollars were allocated to high-priority needs that did not have other funding sources. So including these expenses provides a better picture of the service level needs. If we include expenditures from these one-time funds, the average annual expense growth rate over these 5 years increases to 5.1%, as shown on the bottom of the slide. Our current revenue structure would not support adding these additional expenses. So we need to find new revenue and or make additional service reductions to balance revenues and expenditures as we look to the long term. Budget strategies resulting from the Great Recession started in earnest in fiscal year 10 and have occurred in most years since, as is shown here on this slide. These strategies represent a mix of service reductions, efficiency reductions, and realignment. So when possible, we've moved services to other funds when it's appropriate, and revenue increases such as service fees. While many of these strategies were ongoing in nature, some were at one time or other limited duration term, maybe 2 to 3 years. $60 million in reductions is significant, and the result is a very lean organization. While we continue to look at the ways to be as efficient as possible and streamline service delivery as we look to the future, the impacts of these reductions have been felt within our organization and by the community as service areas have been reduced. At the same time, our community is growing and service demand is increasing. At our last work session on this topic, a question was asked about how much money the city spends on per resident over time. This chart shows the general fund adopted operating budget per capita over 18 years between fiscal year 08 and fiscal year 25. It's important to note that these figures have been adjusted for inflation and are shown in today's dollars. You can see that the trend has been relatively flat over time, and we are spending less per resident today than in fiscal year 08 after adjusting for inflation. This slide is over the same time period and shows total citywide FTE per thousand across all funds. While you see some increases in the out years, this is primarily due to our non-general funds, such as the FTE that was added with the community safety payroll tax. While we have increased FTE, we have not increased to our pre-recession levels. And this is a similar look at our general fund. You can see that the general fund FTE per thousand have decreased during the same time period as budget strategies have been implemented over time. So as we've had conversations with you, with council and the revenue advisor team, we've talked about the funding issues that are shown here. The critical funding gap is our structural gap in our general fund. This is the $8.3 million that starts this July and is our most pressing need as solutions need to be implemented beginning this summer. Areas at risk are services that were funded with one-time dollars that are approaching the end of funding as we look to the future biennia. So things we funded with one-time dollars such as in-house services, one-time funding for Human Service Commission funding, we funded with opioid dollars in the biennium. And then we know we have library and park levies that will expire later in the forecast period. The third area is new and expanded services. These are services such as affordable housing and sustainability efforts. And we funded these largely with limited duration funding or one-time funds and some limited ongoing funding. However, the community desire for these funds are greater than the current funding we have in our system. Additionally, as our community continues to grow, expanded services such as new fire stations and other infrastructure will be needed. So the revenue advisors, as Sarah said, spent some time discussing almost 15 revenue options for these different issues, considering what tools are available that make sense for each issue. While there are several mechanisms identified for each funding issue, the solutions that we talk about today will be focused on our critical funding gap that begins this July. There will be continued conversations in the future about other funding issues and potential tools to provide funding in these areas. And then as we solve for the near-term structural gap in the general fund, we know we have a long-term funding gap that will continue in the out years of the forecast. Solutions we develop now will not affect our structural imbalance where expenditures will continue to outpace revenue growth. The tools shown here are some longer-term strategies that will take more time to develop, and they can't be implemented in time to address our gap that begins this summer. These concepts are reflected in the city, state, and federal legislative priorities and will continue to be part of the ongoing discussion for solutions and part of future council conversations. Additionally, while there are some actions we can take at the local level, other issues such as property tax reform require a solution at the state level, and there are conversations happening with other cities and the league on some of these issues. And so with that, I'll hand things over to Matt to talk about the solutions we've developed.
Thank you, Twyla. Okay. So in this graph, you can see in FY25, the $8.3 million general fund gap that Twyla talked about. Remember, FY25 is the second year of our current biennium. And you can also see how that gap grows by an additional $5.6 million for a total of $13.9 million in FY26, which is the first year of the next biennium. So what we're going to talk about here is walk through some potential budget strategies that we could layer to address not only the gap in the next 2 years, but ongoing. And part of this is really going to be built on a lot of the learning we've done over the past year plus as we've done deep dives into all of our services, really understanding where there might still be some opportunity for efficiencies, even though Twyla shared we've done a ton of that already, and looking what the potential impacts are if we dial a service up or we dial it down. Additionally, we're going to look at the potential to add 2 new fees, as Sarah talked about, which was one of the kind of most viable revenue strategies that was identified by the Revenue Committee. And those 2 fees would be a parks fee implemented under stormwater, the existing stormwater fee, and then a fire fee that's dedicated to fire service. And I'll kind of talk about how that'll work. So through, again, hours and hours and hours of work by our exec team, working with each of their departments, we've really been reviewing potential strategies to save money and reduce the general fund gap. These are rough numbers I'm showing you, so they're not done and we continue to refine them. But through that work, we've really identified about $3 million in ongoing reductions we think we can implement in FY25. Those are things like, again, like true efficiencies we'd want to do no matter what the budget situation was. Others are, maybe smaller impact service adjustments that we can make to try and build a number of small changes to have a, fairly significant impact on the ongoing gap. We also identified about $700,000 in ongoing revenues. These would be adjustments to existing fees that we have where we administratively adjust them. That's thinking about whether a fee might need to be adjusted given the inflationary rates we've seen recently or the level of cost recovery in a current fee. About 1.5 million in one-time reductions that could be savings in materials and services. It could be open job positions that we leave open for a while to save money. It's even looking at things like our insurance rates, since we're self-insured, and seeing if there's any one-time adjustment that can be made based on the actuals we're seeing. About $1.7 million in one-time revenue. That's a number of different strategies, including looking at selling a surplus property. And here's where we talk about adding a new revenue source. So this is showing a parks fee on the order of about $1 million, and that would be collected through our existing stormwater fee that is on the eWeb bill. And I'll talk more in depth about that in a couple minutes. So if we layer all these things in, that would leave about a $400,000 gap in FY25. And again, we're continuing to refine all these strategies. So there's the potential we might be able to actually address that within these strategies, or since we can, at least for now, look at it as a one-time gap, we might be able to address that with reserves. So as we look at how these affect the gap moving forward, anything that's an ongoing strategy, new parks fee, $700,000 in ongoing revenue, and the $3 million in ongoing revenue reductions, those would move forward. And those would actually reduce the ongoing gap that we need to address down to about $9.2 million. And all of these things that I talked about in FY25 are things that we would be talking about as part of the supplemental budget process, because the fee is obviously a little bit of a separate conversation, but we would need to be taking action on a number of these things in June. So now we're solving a $9.2 million ongoing gap. A number of, strategies that we've been looking at as an exec team aren't immediately implementable. There's more work that needs to be done to understand their scale, their viability, what the process would be to put them in place. But we do think there's a potential to add about another $300,000 or so in ongoing revenue in FY26. And here's where we really start to contemplate a different solution, and that would be a fire fee. So this fire fee would be kind of in two components, a total of $10 million a year. $8 million would be to stabilize the fire service. It would take $8 million of fire services in the general fund now. It would move them out of the general fund and into their own dedicated funds, so they're insulated from challenges we have in the general fund. It also frees up that $8 million to be used for other services that are general fund services that, if we didn't have a strategy like this, that would potentially be impacted by reductions we need to make. It also adds about $2 million for enhanced service. And Chief Caven is here, who can talk more about, kind of his vision of enhanced service. But we know that, even since the 80s, we really haven't had an addition of firefighters in our community, and we've had a growing community. And I think we've heard from council the wish to think about how we can start to build and enhance our fire service. Since the $8 million component of that would be the only component that really offsets the general fund gap, that still leaves a bit of a gap, $900,000, $1 million. You can see that in orange. We believe we have one-time revenue strategies in FY26 that can address that. Again, mix of strategies, including potentially selling some surplus property. So if you think about this in this example, we get through FY26, what it leaves is an ongoing gap to solve of around $900,000 or $1 million. Again, these are rough numbers that we're working with and continuing to refine. And we do always have, forecasts that change over time. Since we are, again, continuing to refine strategies that we know might be more appropriate in out years, there's a potential we could address that with, continuing to explore ongoing existing revenues or some adjustments to service. So let's talk about parks fee and a fire fee. So some funding to assist parks related to stormwater has been talked about with council for probably about 15 years. It's come to the table a number of times. As recently as 2016, 2017, there was discussion about that potential. The most straightforward way to actually, collect $1 million to be applied to parks, to move $1 million of parks out of the general fund, would be to make all park services eligible under the existing stormwater user fee. As far as I know, looking back at records, this consideration of a parks fee has always been related to stormwater. There's just been some different ways that it might be implemented under the fee. If we did it in this way, the advantages are it's basically a simple inflationary adjustment to collect an additional $1 million. It would be on the order of 80 cents a month for the average residence. And it doesn't require any changes to the EWEB bill. So, Sarah's talked about our conversations with EWEB. They're great partners. We've talked through just technically how this could work, knowing that they need to have conversations with their board for each of the fees. But this one would really be no change to their bill. It would be easy to implement. Part of why this is important, if we're billing through EWEB, is they're going through a major change to their billing system right now. Their existing system is not flexible. You really can't add a new methodology for any type of fee you want to collect. So if we were to add something, it really needs to fall within the existing way we bill. So having it bill just within the way stormwater is billed would be an advantage. So the fire service fee is different. You know, this would be a new methodology, and we've been doing a lot of work looking at cities around the state, cities in neighboring states, and the best way that you could do this. What we found is really the best practice is to use building square footage to help set the rate for a fire fee. And when we come back and talk to you next, we'll be able to really kind of actually show more detail on what that could look like. But for now, if you had a $10 million fee, it would cost between $10 and $12 a month for the average residence. The reason we have a range, again, is depending on who's billing it. If eWeb were able and willing to bill it, it would probably be more towards 10. If we need to set up our own city billing or contract out billing, it probably starts to rise more towards 12. So let's talk a little bit about service fees across the state. These are not all of the cities that have service fees in place, nor all of their fees, but we wanted to give you a little bit of information you could look at to kind of see what's happening across a range of cities. All of these are in place except for Grants Pass. You can see an asterisk there. That's a conversation that they've been having with their community about setting up a public safety utility fee. So you can see some cities like Salem have a city operations fee. It's fairly broad. You know, it is for general fund services. Others have very specific fees to a service, and others are bundled, like where you can see a public safety fee that has police and fire, or one that even has police, fire, and parks in Gresham. Where we are able to, we've kind of pulled out the piece of these fees where it's a fire fee mixed with something else. That's the fire component. So you can kind of understand a comparable when we talk about this. You can see there's really a wide range of what's being charged. When you think about the fees that we showed in this example compared to what's on the board, again, let's just round up and say, you know, that stormwater is around $1 per month. A fire fee is $10 or $12 a month. You're talking about total $11 to $13 a month that the average residence would be charged. So you can kind of get a little bit of a sense of how that falls into this chart. We'll work on trying to tease this out even a little bit more next time we speak about this. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Sarah.
You want to flip to the next slide? So I'm going to start with several people have asked, like, why fire? And one of the reasons why I think fire and EMS have been often included in city utility bills is because they operate in a similar fashion. It's a 24-hour operation, 7 days a week. You can't shut it off. Our community well-being and business continuity depends on it. And I think about it being sort of, and it's necessary to scale with growth. And so to me, the most similar comparison is like a wastewater utility where you just know you have to be able to grow with time. As you know, from everything they said in our resource limitations, that hasn't happened. And so we actually haven't added a firefighter since the 1980s. Similarly, in last year's, with the exception of last year's budget, where you took an action around the engine, fire services relied almost entirely on property taxes, which have no way at a 4% to keep up with the growth needed or the cost of the service. So to me, it comes down to wanting to preserve and protect the service and growing it to meet the needs of our community. And in order to do that, I think we really do need to find a better portfolio of designated protected resources. So for that reason, when you look at the other options of a levy or a short-term funding situation, that just doesn't make as much sense because there's just not any certainty to that. So with that, that's sort of, we can talk more about this. We have lots of time. The plan right now is we'll be back on May 13th with a work session to talk more specifically about stormwater. And if that's something that you want to support, you'll have a motion to be able to move that to a public hearing. And then you wouldn't be making any kind of decision about that until probably July, late June, July. You have, at the same time, we're still thinking through, but I'm also going to want to see like head nods and support or a motion that says continue working on the fire fee, that we know this is going to take more time. Even the revenue advisors, devil's in the details. So we need some time to think about the structure, how we would do it, work through different impacts. We'd be back in the fall with more information, ability for you to continue moving that forward. But we want to know that you want us to continue exploring it. So we'll be looking for that in May. We have our budget committee meeting on May 22nd. We've tried really hard and we haven't landed on the total package that lands in that 3 million, but we've really tried hard to make that, we've really tried to put bigger reductions in the out year where you would have a full budget process and not a supplemental budget process. But at that meeting, we'll walk through with them the revenue discussions and walk through what the reduction scenarios are. You'll take council budget action in June, at the end of June. So all these things sort of line up. So if you say yes to the stormwater fee and we do a public hearing and then we take action, we may have to actually recognize that on a later supplemental budget because it won't all land in time. That's where we are today, and we're looking forward to your feedback and conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I already know I have Mike in the queue, and I don't know, and Matt. Okay. Anybody else ready? All right. Mike, I'll let you kick it off.
Thank you, Mayor. Could you reset slide number 3? Is that possible? And while I'm saying this, I already know that my comments will elicit my friend Alan to want to have a response. So I'll try and address that in advance. I appreciate manager's work with staff and Twyla and all that. I think this is a very creative solution. I understand the nature of the solution is a short-term one, and that creates a different set of potential solutions than other opportunities. I think, however, that what we have is, in my estimation, more of a long-term problem that to fix, in my mind, properly, we really need to focus on the long-term solution, but doesn't mean it relieves us of the need to solve the short-term problem. So I appreciate what you put forward with this so far. On slide number 3, what you'll see here gets to my issue with, next one, please. I apologize. I assumed that was 3. This is the issue for me. What we're talking about are 2 new creative ways to get more money from the same people. Measures 5 and 50 were designed to say, hey, with property taxes, you can only get so much. And that's what you mentioned up here. And you mentioned in the potential for legislative changes that we've been advocating for. For me, we don't do enough work to say, okay, there's a growing number of people that we're trying to serve because our community is growing. When you look at that chart, it's very clear that 71%, the majority of our revenues come from property. And while we're saying the rate can't change, and thus it shows the limitation of 4%, what we're not doing is saying, how do we increase the taxable value of that property? Or how do we increase the amount of property that we consider is in Eugene? And that's where I think we're falling down on our ability to solve the long-term problem, because there's all kinds of people moving here and new services, and we're growing that really, really well. But we're not growing the amount of taxable property that is the vast majority of the base of our revenue stream. So it's not as wise from my standpoint to continue to even consider increasing services and the cost of them while we're not at the same time developing strategies to increase our most pressing and our most central revenue stream. And I'm out of time, so I'll take a second round to talk about that a little further, please, Mayor.
That's fine. Thank you. Matt.
Thank you. Councilor Clark got me thinking, we're in Oregon, a 2-legged stool, property tax and an income tax state, which is why I thank the members of the revenue team for getting creative and looking at other options, that third leg of the stool. Around the corner, I continued to champion a soda tax, a high fructose corn syrup tax that would benefit Health and Human Services. People are still going to pay $9 a pop, pun intended, at Autzen Stadium. A Ticketmaster surcharge for folks who are coming in from out of town who are spending their money here. I appreciate that, but whether it's a concert or a sporting event, we should be putting those dollars toward our roads fund, a vacancy tax to generate rail revenue for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. But what's in front of us right here is fascinating, and I applaud the creativity And I would like to, retain eWeb as, if willing, as a billing partner for the proposed, parks fee. I'd like to learn more about what an 80 cents per month would look like. And maybe this question is for Chief Caven. If we were to explore, and I am giving you the nod, yes, please, let's explore, said, proposed fire fee. What does an additional 2 million of enhanced services mean, Chief? Does it mean firewise and hardening to reduce the risk of wildfire? Is it equipment or is it personnel only?
Thanks for the question. So right now, our strategies in a number of locations in the community to make investments is with a squad concept. We talked a little bit about that in the budget process last year, 2-person crew in a wildland type vehicle, smaller, more nimble. And so that resource, about $1.5 to $1.6 million of that would fund that type of vehicle and the personnel to staff it on an ongoing basis. So it does enhance our ability to respond to the overwhelming majority of our responses, which are EMS and in particular time-dependent EMS calls. Provide some additional firefighters to enhance our regular fire response. But most importantly, it also provides a staff vehicle for the ever-growing threat from wildfire.
Very helpful. Thank you. I don't necessarily need the answer tonight, Mayor, but I'm curious when we come back for our next work session, I would like to ask the question, what's the return on investment for this municipality to participate in annual dues paying organizations like League of Cities? While well-intentioned, from my vantage point, LOC will often give voice to significantly smaller cities and communities that aren't necessarily in alignment with City of Eugene stated goals and priorities. So I would like to see, what our annual contribution to outside organizations is, and if we are getting a return on investment in that arena. I think that's all I got right now, Mayor. Oh, I would like to see when we come back for that work session in May, the proposed fire fee for enhanced services. I'd very much like to look to see if it's progressively structured by square footage. If we said on average at $11, maybe there's an opportunity for an 8, 10, or 12, or a 6, 10, and 14. So folks who are scaling down or folks who are on the lower part of that income scale aren't hit as significantly as a more affluent crowd.
Thank you, Councilor. I can speak briefly to that. We are modeling that, so we'll be able to bring back those type of options for you.
Thank you.
Okay, Randy.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Twyla and Matt, for the presentation. And I also appreciate the focus group that was looking at this, how we're going to fund our city services. Like Councilor Clark, I loathe adding new fees on people who are already feeling maxed out. But at the same time, I'm just not seeing any other good solutions at this point. So I do support going ahead and looking at this. I like the idea of taking one of our key services and putting it on a more stable funding stream. I am acutely aware that fire has not grown over the years. I started as a firefighter here in 1980, and we basically have the same number of people on the street today that we had when I started. Chief and I did a count on that, walking through each station and what they had when I was just a little firefighter. So I'm aware at the same time call volume has increased many times over, and it's not slowing down, which does concern me. I do appreciate the work fire and other departments have done to try and figure out how to come at some of our burgeoning growth without adding additional resources, but I really believe that we're pretty well tapped out. Are we considering conducting any polling before we move ahead, so we kind of get a feel where people are?
We've talked about it. We haven't done that yet, but that's certainly something we can explore.
I mean, I think we should explore it once we narrow this down a little bit more. I also like that, the thought of putting parks on, the stormwater piece. I think there's a strong nexus there. I think what we're looking at is a relatively small additional fee. And I know that parks are very important to our public, as is fire and community safety. So, I don't have a problem with those, pieces as we look at how we're doing this, but I think we're gonna have to have a pretty good justification if we move forward with this, so that people really, really understand what the problem is, what we're trying to do to fix it, but also what we're trying to do to reduce some of our cost and overhead as much as we can, and talk about things that we have done, because I know we've done good things over the years, but it's like anything. If you incrementally move in a direction, it's hard to really see the total, the sum of the parts, so to speak, because we're doing it just a step at a time. So I think it's going to be really important that we manage our story on this so that people understand factually what has happened, how we got to where we are, and how we're trying to get out of it. And I may need a second round, Mayor, but I want to hear what other colleagues say. Thank you.
Got it.
Yeah, Emily.
Thank you. Can you talk about the library? We're hearing a lot from people who are worried about the library since it was cut last time. So any plans about that?
Yeah, I can talk about that. We're still trying to finalize what's in that mix of 3 million. There's little bits from each department that to get there. So I don't want to say there's no impacts to the library, but we'll be talking more about that as we get closer to the supplemental budget and start talking, finalize the list. And it really, I mean, the reason why I'm need a little bit more time is it's until you decide, yes, we kind of want to go forward with this park stormwater, we're interested in exploring it. It's harder for me to know, do we have another $1 million we have to add to our supplemental budget piece or not? But that'll become more clear.
I think the parks fee is fine. It's not a huge fee and people do like parks. It would get us over a little bit of immediate scary times. The fire fee, I certainly believe everybody wants a fire department, but that's a big chunk there. And, if the small houses are not paying substantially less than the big houses, it's going to have an uneven impact on people. And I think fire is so essential, even if you don't have to call them, just to your well-being, presence of mind. Yes, I want to support fire, yes, but I'm really cautious about that much, and especially if it's even across, then that's not right.
Okay, thank you. Jennifer and then Lindsay.
Thank you. So I had a couple questions. If you mentioned that using the stormwater fee for parks has been discussed on and off for about 16 years, and I'm wondering if anyone knows what the hesitation has been to not do it. It sounds like a good idea, but clearly it has been up for discussion. So I'm wondering, why did they not do it before? If anyone knows it, if you don't know, that's okay.
So Sarah would probably know more about the early conversations or even conversations.
I think there's been various reasons why. Initially, I think it's just one of those interested, not quite ready to get there yet. The city service fee discussion kind of entered into the middle of that. So things kind of got paused while we talked about that. And then I think we changed our focus to trying to fund the critical needs in police. So it's just,
Okay.
it's maybe just it's time now.
That makes sense. So I had a question about the fire fee. So Chief Caven, so we're also discussing the whole structure of our fire department and some things we might want to change or not want to change. And I'm wondering if would this fee work in those different scenarios?
So the fee provides, outside of that chunk that was discussed about stabilizing the service or components of the service, It allows us to be much more intentional about our planning, especially in the alternative response phase, where we can leverage a program or a project with much smaller incremental fee increases over time or other changes to the organization. As far as structurally as a fire department, right now we're trying to focus on what parts of the community that have grown in different ways do we have response coverage issues. And so we're both challenged with an alternative response goal while at the same time trying to catch up with growth in a geographical problem. And so long answer to your question, but yes, I mean, it can be leveraged in a number of different ways.
Except that I think, were you talking about the governance structure?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Oh, I totally
So in
missed
that sense, I think it's okay. I mean,
I was not clear either, sorry.
yeah, so it's, it'd be a city of Eugene fee, and it would be very similar to our wastewater model where we charge a wastewater fee, and that is both places. So if you end up with an intergovernmental entity type thing, it would work just like the wastewater utility fee does right now.
Great, that was also interesting though.
what she said.
Great.
Good team.
So yeah, so the question is, do I think that we should move forward in this discussion? So my answer is yes. I think this sounds like a very viable option. I would be interested in us exploring more and learning more about it and some of the particulars. I get why you would do it by size of structure. That makes sense for fire, less sense for EMS, which sounds like a lot of our services are EMS. If you need an ambulance, it doesn't matter how big your house is, it's going to cost the same, I assume. So, but I also do not have an alternative suggestion. I know that that's kind of a hard thing to determine how folks pay and equity around that kind of stuff. So would also like to see some of that come back as well. What are some different models that other cities use? It looks like a lot of folks do similar things already. So do they do it by square foot, or what our other options might be? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Lindsay.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Carla and Matt and Sarah. I mean, this was such an immense amount of work to go through. So just greatly appreciate all of that work. And thank you for appointing me to the Revenue Committee. I got to have the opportunity to learn so much about all of the different mechanisms. Obviously, none of us want to see fees raised in our city. It's a really tough thing to talk about and think about, especially for people who are low income. And there was a lot of discussion around that equity piece and how can we make things progressive and consider all of the ways that we can lessen the impact on people. But overwhelmingly, the committee really felt that this city services fee or fire fee would be more viable option than just about anything else. And so while it's difficult, we do have an emergency kind of situation with this budget, and I'm really impressed with the way that you've been able to address this like short-term funding gap for the next year and do a lot of reductions. So I'm very supportive of the stormwater into parks and really interested in learning more about how we can implement that. I think it's a nice thing to have it be in its own fund so that we can have a little bit more assurances for that fire. And so again, thank you for all your work, and I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. Alan.
Yeah, I'd heard this before. It keeps getting better. And Mr. My PowerPoint animations are, it even got even better than last time. I wanted to address, if you could bring up slide 6, the folks that are wondering if we're well managed or are we just growing out of control. And slide 6 is an interesting slide. It shows that out of the last 16 budgets, 13 have been cut budgets. And out of my 28 budgets that I've been involved in, I can only think of a handful that weren't cut budgets. So most of the time we're in cut mode, especially for the general fund, in particular for the general fund. You go to slide 7. This is a particularly important slide too. It's a general fund operating budget per capita. It's the lowest it's been in 20 years, almost 20 years. And slide 8, another one. This is citywide FTE per 1,000 population. Pretty much stayed the same over the last 15 years or so. It's nothing real unusual about that graph. And the city has grown dramatically. If you were to put a graph that showed city population growth over that, those two lines wouldn't be the same line at all. So we've grown tremendously, but not added tremendous amount of staff per population. And then the stunner is actually the next slide, slide 9, which is FTE per 1,000 population. It's the lowest it's been in 18 years. And every single one of those years, it's lower. What does that mean? That means that every year we're doing the same amount of services or equivalent thereabouts with less and less people in the general fund. And that's police, fire, library and recreation, and central services. And the last number of 4.6 is 80% of what it was in 2008. So it's like a 20% cut. So if you think about whether or not we're managed, I think those are very illustrative slides. I think the process that we went through was a good one, and really good staff work and good thoughtful outcome for a plan, for the plan. The service fee in particular for fire, not new, not uncommon. I think there's 10 or more cities that are doing this already. I did have a question about the stormwater fee. So putting parks in the stormwater fee doesn't entail an increase. It just allows us to use some of the stormwater monies to pay for parks, which enables parks to do their work with more money, basically.
So the concept, as we showed it, would include an 80 cent per month increase
to pay for
generate $1 million more with the stormwater fee, which would then go to parks and move that portion of parks out of the general fund.
All right.
Can I give you a second round?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I think everyone's had a first round except for Greg. I haven't seen a hand raised. So I have Mike, then Randy, then Alan for second rounds.
Thank you, Mayor. Alan brings up an interesting point.
Okay.
My concern is that I don't want to see us looking for new and interesting ways to get more money from the same base of taxpayers. I think that the wise, especially long-term choice, is for us to grow that base rather than the percentage of money we get from that base. So Chief Caven, I want to throw a hypothetical your way. There's a fire this evening in Santa Clara, and it occurs as a residential fire at a place that is listed as a county resident, not a city of Eugene resident, but they're surrounded on this particular home on all sides by those that are annexed into the city of Eugene. What's our fire department's response?
If that fire were to happen tonight, they would get the exact same response that happens anywhere else in the city.
Even though they don't pay city of Eugene property taxes?
Correct. There's an existing automatic aid agreement in place from 2019 that we're currently working on the inequities that exist in that and addressing a more standard response to all of our partnering agencies. But as it stands right now, the last 2 structure fires that have occurred out in that area have not been in our jurisdiction. However, our units did arrive first and provide all but one of the suppression units.
Including emergency medical services.
The emergency medical services side of that agreement is where there is what we call reciprocation. The Lane Fire Authority provides a fire engine that they're closer to in the northern Santa Clara area. We provide all the southern.
My reason for picking on you is it's good policy. It makes sense. It protects those residents that are there when a neighbor's home is on fire. It makes perfect sense to do. But this is one example of many where we're not even measuring how do we expand the base? How much, for example, how many homes, average home value and what increase in number of homes would it take to cover this gap with building new homes, which we desperately need because the number of people moving here are increasing. And in the slides that you showed with the increase in population, are those all people whose residences you verify are inside the city, or do some of those folks live in River Road and Santa Clara in the county area? Would you know? I mean, I don't know.
So on these slides, we're taking Eugene population and we're applying population growth factors. So in this case, you know, like 1% over time.
I want us to do a better job of measuring how do we increase the property tax base, not only in those places where, as I brought up this issue before, I think voluntary program of annexation, of inviting those members of the community who already think they live in Eugene and Springfield, especially if they're renting, to join us. And as well as where do we need to have new lands that are maybe within the UGB already, but aren't currently serviceable and have homes built on them so we can have enough homes for people in our community, which we're in crisis mode for. Those are the kind of long-term plans that I hope we're going to focus more on. How do we invite everyone to join us at the table, and how do we make the lands already within our UGB, much less an expansion, more valuable and add new taxpayers to the base. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to turn to Alan for his second round because you'd like to wait.
Well, thanks for talking about growth, Mike. I thanks for talking about in the long term, as increasing in the tax base is a good strategy for the long term, but it doesn't help us in the short term. We can't grow our way out of this short term problem. Tyler, you had a graphic or a calculation of how many Valley River Centers worth of investment equals $1 million. It's like one Valley River Center equals $1 million in general fund. So we would need, so we'd need like 14 Valley River Centers worth of growth to happen. Value, right? Yeah, that kind of growth to happen in the next year or two to solve our problem. Not going to happen. We don't see that kind of growth. Should that say we don't do that? No, it means that you got to put it into perspective. So that's a strategy we kind of should always be looking at and moving forward with. But growth's not going to solve our short-term problem right now. Does the fire fee require a vote? Putting it in place?
Over here. No, I believe and Matt could speak to this more closely, but I mean, what will be discussed with you at your next meeting would be a code amendment.
Yeah.
So we could do it.
Just like we did with the other fees that we charged through the eWeb. So I think the additional dollars for wildfire is a pressing problem. We just had the first large, gigantic potentially gigantic wildfire in my ward over in the Laurel Hill Valley. That was super scary when people are staying in their backyard watching flames. Unfortunately, because of climate change, that's going to get worse and become a bigger problem, and it's screaming for funding because we just don't have it. So I think that's a great add to our services from the fire department. And having went through this, I support the plan. I'm very interested in seeing the details as they come back to us, and they'll be coming in the next couple of meetings.
Okay, Randy?
Thank you, Mayor. And I really appreciate the discussion. I'm glad that Mike is pounding the drum on managed growth. I still think it's more commercial and industrial. It's going to make a difference and really move the needle on our tax base, but also providing jobs. However, we do need more housing too, which we all know. So it's trying to figure out how we do two tracks in my mind. What are we doing for the short to medium term? And then what are we doing for the longer term, which I think comes back to economic growth. And I think that's what Alan is getting at. And going back to what I've shared before, Councillor Evans and I have met with a number of solar panel manufacturers that were ready and interested in locating here. They just couldn't find the size of parcels that they need to operate. So they are looking at other places in Oregon. And those are lost opportunities because that's a very clean industry. And what we also learned in the process is usually where one comes, they usually come with even their competition and then bring the supporting industry with them. So we're talking fairly fast growth with a lot of jobs. They're well-funded corporations, but we just have nothing to attract them here with. I mean, we have lots to attract them with. We just don't have the land to build on. So I really think we need to have kind of that long-term look and the strategies around that. And what are we really going to do about it? And then the shorter term, which is what I think we're talking about here tonight. The other piece, just one addition to what Alan was saying, I really appreciate the way you walked us through those slides. That was very instructional, and I think that really kind of helped me get my head wrapped around it. But you're saying the same service with fewer people. That's not true. They're actually providing more service than they were before because the population base is driving the work. You know, I've watched, and I'll take fire because it's what I'm the most familiar with. I've watched a high vertical climb in call volume with the same number of people, and it's crazy. That can't go on forever. And it's also looking what's driving a lot of our calls too. I mean, that's another piece of it. I know the chief is working very diligently to try to pair off less essential calls that can be provided more economically and more efficiently in another way. And so from that standpoint, the exercise has been good, but it does concern me how we have eroded our response capacity. But also, I mean, you know, you take every service area, library, parks, all of them. These are things we need to figure out how we're going to address and what the appetite is of the public. Even though we could impose it, I still think we need to be asking. Thank you.
Thank you. Matt.
Thanks, Mayor. I just have two quick follow-up questions. One is especially is the only currently serving renter on council. Are we looking at these proposed fire fees at that $10 or $12, $11 on average, and if progressively structured to be every household, or are there communities in which it's the property owner that pays and not the renter? How is it structured in other communities?
I think there's a mix, Counselor Keating, and that's part of what we would need to really dig into as if you want us to continue to look at the fee. So if we did bill the fee through eWeb, if that was something they were willing to support, it would be based on eWeb accounts, right? That's the way they would be able to bill it. If we did it ourselves or did it through a consultant, we could probably look at different ways. But part of that is a lot of work that's happening by a kind of revenue research team we have to really understand the mechanism, how you would do it, how you would, you know, assign square footage to whom, especially if they're in the same building. So that would be part of what we need to continue to explore. I appreciate the willingness to explore all options, and I would caution just attaching it to someone who has an eWeb account, and it might get to my vacancy tax concept if vacant homes, which are just as susceptible to burn down, if owners who are just sitting on property and that property isn't generating any economic activity or providing any housing, I wouldn't want them to get a slide. Frankly, I'd want those properties to pay a whole heck of a lot. Sure. So maybe I can just add something on that to clarify, because I think I probably didn't give you all the information you needed. So we have our own account. So their eWeb does the billing. Mm-hmm. And then we have stormwater and wastewater bills currently through them. They're not all the same folks that get billed. An example would be that in River Road, Santa Clara, outside the city limit, there are people that actually are hooked up to the wastewater system. They receive a bill. Stormwater is only for people within the city limits. So for stormwater, whether or not, so we can use the stormwater base to help inform billing. It's not just kind of who's receiving water service. So for stormwater, if there's impervious area on a lot, like an old building, even if it's not occupied, you'd still actually have a bill that goes to you that we could use to help set up a fee. So that's getting into the weeds, but that's the type of thing that we would be working on to try and develop and present to you.
Thank you. Follow-up question for Chief Caven. Similar to the county's approach in regards to tapping into state and federal dollars for fire-wise hardening, are there any incentives that our IGR team could look at to lobby lawmakers in regards to help offset some of these costs that the residents or property owners are going to absorb if they engage in some sort of fire-wise hardening activity within the UGB?
So I think on Wednesday, you'll get a little bit of a report back from our trip on United Front to Washington, D.C., where we talked about some of those strategies or the roadblocks for our community and our area's ability to access some of the dollars, particularly from the Department of Agriculture, a little bit from BLM. We do leverage BLM funding through the parks team, use that to help protect in the South Hills area and the Rivered Ridges trail. And for us, as we look at other strategies, the development of our wildfire planning and fuels management program will help bring better access to leveraging. There are different incentives that we're exploring to bring to the community. Can't answer, I mean, it would have to come back in how we explore how it might apply into a fire fee scenario. But we're actively looking for different options in that space.
Thanks. I look forward to that report. I suspect it would be a little more palatable if that's happening simultaneously as this is happening.
One of the community programs that we've been looking at is Boulder, Colorado, where they've really leveraged the community to do and be engaged in that work more than the government putting it on them or paying for it, through incentive-based programs and community partnerships with business, et cetera. So
Great.
There's a lot of good information emerging from that investment through the payroll tax.
Thank you, Chief.
Yep.
Okay, Mike, did you need a third round? Okay.
Just really quick. I appreciated Alan's comments. Twyla, do you happen to know what the taxable value of Valley River Center is?
Looking over to my friend here on the side.
Sorry, what?
It's in the neighborhood of 100 million.
100 million-ish.
My point is, I want us to be taught, one of the issues is that we've had this conversation about a shortage that we're trying to fill at least 4 or 5 times in the last few years that I remember. I mean, just in very short last few years. But to Alan's point, it always comes up that, well, that's a short-term problem and we need a short-term solution. And what you're talking about, Mike, with the base isn't a short-term solution. And so it gets abandoned as something we need to focus energy on. And I think that's a mistake. I appreciate what Randy said, but we don't even talk about it in those terms. How much taxable base is necessary? How much taxable base growth is necessary to handle our long-term budget within our existing base? What do we need to do, and what are some strategies in order to reconcile our expenditure base and our taxable base on a longer term basis? And I agree, it needs to be, because, you know, one Valley River Center and one giant local manufacturing thing may not be that different, but, you know, it may take X number of residential houses to equal one Valley River Center. And I grant that, but we're in a crisis of shortage of homes for people to live in. And we need to see more of them developed and built more quickly, and to see that value of those new homes on new land within even our own existing urban growth boundary at an expanded rate. We need to see that growth so that the tax base growth keeps up with our expenditure growth. And I'm just asking, what do I need to do? A work session poll? What do we need to do in order to have an analysis about what will that take and what are some strategies for doing that? Is that a work session poll that we should be Holding, or I'm asking the
Thinking
manager.
on my
what she
unfeed
wants to
here.
do. Yeah.
Thinking on my unfeed. What I was thinking is that we have done some analysis in the past around costs, revenue we'd bring in if River Road Santa Clara was all annex, costs of that. What I heard differently tonight, which I think was really interesting, is we've always assumed, okay, if you bring in River Road Santa Clara and you assume that property tax revenue, you also have to serve those customers. And so our cost goes up. So what I heard tonight is, at least from a fire standpoint, if that's already happening, we might need to make some adjustments to our previous work. Your next question about how fast would we have to grow in order to, if you use this mechanism to close the gap, and your next question is how fast would we have to grow to stay ahead of it? I just have to think through how we would do that. It could be that this would all be good for a work session, so you can have a deeper discussion about it and really understand it. Because when you're talking about it, I see where you're trying to go, and I think it's and a lot of people are trying to go to that same place. So I think it's worth exploring. Part of my concern is, at the end of the day, if nothing changes with our current tax system, you're still at the end of the day only going to ever be able to grow any of those services by 4% every year. And you may always be trying to catch up if that's all you relied on. But if you establish something like this and you're just trying to keep up, that may be a different story.
Well, what I'm saying is that's not actually the case once you get a new taxpayer into the mix, into the base of taxpayer.
The initial, that initial investment comes in, but then it's 4% after that.
By law.
I understand that part. That's not what I'm saying.
So I think
You're
it's
equating that
working.
expenditure, and up here it's compared based on people, not acres. And that's what I'm saying, or value.
Okay.
And that's the analysis we're not doing. How many manufacturing facilities at X number of dollars value per acre would have to become new taxpayers to increase the base amount? And that would increase over time, of course, as you mentioned. But we're only talking about the increase rate rather than the increase amount. And that's the piece I think we should be focused on.
Thank you for that conversation. The thing that I keep coming back to is the work session that we had years ago about the value per acre, and we came back to it in the downtown discussion again around sort of the premise that we've been operating from to a great extent is that the infrastructure costs are less with that sort of denser development in areas that are already developed. And I know that Mike doesn't quite buy into that. So I know that's part of it, but that has been part of the question. And then the other question is that with the industrial land, we have industrial land, but we don't have the infrastructure there. And there's a huge cost associated with bringing that on board. So when you're talking about, you have to just balance out, it's not, that development is not cost free either. And we've been functioning under certain premises about where the cost is less for growth. So maybe that whole picture would be valuable, to sort of bring it all back to us to talk about. Alan.
So that kind of brings up the question of gross versus net, because the $1 million for a Valley River Center worth of business investment is the gross number, not the net number. And so having that calculation, having that conversation about what is it? So when we get new development, we have to serve it, and it has a cost to it. So that creates costs that tip into that revenue because we have to increase our services, but not in all cases, like fire, not necessarily, but in other places we do have to do that. And just a PSA, while we don't have incentives for people in the city of Eugene that didn't experience the horrific wildfires, the state spent or allocated $900 million to the wildfires that went up and down the state. And a lot of money is going into rebuilding and with incentives to do hardening and also energy efficiency and other things and making sure your property is more defensible. So there's a lot of incentives dollars to actually do that when you rebuild, just in case you have a house in one of those areas.
So I have one more comment I want to make. I want to make sure that counselors all had a chance to chime in. I just wanted to, I wanted to say a couple of things, which is that, first of all, I really have a huge amount of appreciation and admiration for how this discussion rolled out, for the work that the staff did to sort of help that conversation in the Revenue Committee move forward in a really thoughtful and deliberative way, in a really well-informed way. And I'm really, it was a very interesting conversation around the amount of dollars you would raise, the scope of the impact that you can have through certain mechanisms versus, and the sort of political feasibility of things and the equity component. So it was a really valuable conversation. And as we did earlier with the community safety payroll tax, the places where you landed were more or less that everybody pays, but they pay a small amount. It's broad, but it's shallow, as opposed to some of the options that were on the table that were narrow and deep. And so I do think that even though there's concern about how much can the taxpayers withstand and when are we overloading, at the same point, recognizing that where we are is everybody is getting these services, everybody is paying a small amount of increase so that the overall reliability of the system is strengthened. So I'm hearing from all of you that you're ready to that you support moving forward on this conversation. I'm not seeing anyone saying not okay, but I really appreciate the work and appreciate the conversation. Yeah, Randy.
Thank you, Mayor. And yes, I support going forward and talking about the short-term strategy, but I still don't feel like I heard an answer on, do we need a work session poll for the economic development piece, the big piece, or is that something we're just going to do?
That's gonna happen.
Yeah, what I was gonna suggest, and you moved on, but would be that we meet with Counselor Clark to make sure I understand exactly what he's trying to get at and help craft what that poll could potentially look like, and checking in with a couple of you too. So it seems like there's a lot of things that might want to be addressed here. And it fits into, we've already said we're working on a long-term financial plan. This is a little bit, it's related to, it's right there in the same book. It's not specific to finance. It's much broader. So we can have that meeting and discussion and see whether you need a poll or whether we just bring it as part of that.
Thank you.
I just want to provide a quick clarification. By example, my in-laws, Becca's parents, live just outside the UGB and county territory, just like off Willamette at the base of Spencer's View. And they received a county grant for their fire-wise hardening of their property. It was the smart thing to do. Dollars came back to them. That's what I'm advocating for within the UGB is, let's say you're, whatever the formula is, 3,000 feet, 5,000 feet, so it's a mile maybe within the UGB. Perhaps there are incentives to explore and secure for our residents who are just as susceptible as my in-laws, but they happen to live within the city boundaries, so they wouldn't have access to those county dollars. That's what I'm longing for.
We did have a grant for that.
Yes, we've leveraged different grants for kind of community-wide work, and we do work with the Northwest Youth Corps on projects. But to the point, completely understand your request and exploring what could we bring here, how could we leverage that. The challenges around kind of funding availability and eligibility requirements that came from the state, and then other programs like the Community Wildfire Development Grants, which come from the USDA, are based on risk, at which we are not designated at risk, which is a problem because we know we are. So, yeah.
Emily, you have another?
Thank you. I know it's a touchy subject, but a bunch of years ago, we talked about increasing the franchise rate for natural gas, which we have not done. If we were to do that, I forget what percentage we were talking about. I think it's at 5 now, so 6.5 or 7. Do we know how much more money that would bring us?
Good question.
I have the revenue report right here. I have to open it up. One of the things we tried to do, because we're focusing on that critical gap, that urgent right here gap, was we tried not to also utilize the revenue streams that were identified as being a good source for other additional work. So for example, if you wanted to ramp up climate work, maybe that's your source for that. So we tried to be thoughtful about the long-term plan and how you do all the things. But I can pull that up too if you don't already have it.
And so how long-term would it take to put on a franchise fee? Is that something we could do fairly quickly, or is?
It would be a code amendment. Currently, the 5% that is being charged is in your code. And then it would also require, we have the way your franchises work through your charter.
I've got it.
Do you have it?
Yeah, so 1% increase based on our 22-23 earnings from natural gas supplier tax. A 1% increase would generate approximately $300,000 to $400,000. So if you increase it to, it's twice that.
Not a huge amount, not that I'm, missing $600,000.
Yeah. And also, if you remember, our franchises is an ordinance and it's a contract. So we have, what you're really talking about is we have a separate fee that's in your code. So that's what you would be looking at changing. Not changing the agreement, but
Right, not, the agreement would stay the same. We just like, hey, we want more money.
yeah, that's right. We don't have an agreement. I apologize.
They don't have
Have a contract.
Yeah.
Right now.
So we would change that they're being charged the 5%, because that is a code function. And so that was what you would be looking at. It would be a code amendment.
Well, I know it's not gonna change, the whole problem, but, we did have that 300,000 that was going along every year, and that would be a way to at least not have to worry about that. And it's been a really long time, since we got money from them. So I think that should be on the table.
So if I could, I know Alan wants to speak. Well, Alan, go for it. And then I have something to say about it.
Thanks for that, because it reminded me of a conversation the mayor and I had about the other things that were in the revenue arena, which was where this actually came from. I think almost 3 years ago, I suggested a work session on revenue sources for climate change and homelessness / housing services. And so what we've been talking about is just fixing the institutional problem of a deficit budget for all the services that we currently provide. But the whole discussion about adding services in climate change, like a 3% increase in franchise fee, get you $900,000 to work on climate change projects on an annual basis. And there's other ways to increase that number. And increasing the CET from 0.5% to 1% gets you several million more dollars to focus on in housing. So those options are still on the table. We haven't moved anywhere with them, which has been frustrating since I brought this up 3 years ago. But that's a conversation that the council could still have and still move towards. This is a priority, but moving in that direction is something we can also do. It's not off the table; it's still there. We haven't moved on it because this took precedence.
I just think that as time goes on, this isn't just going to be the one gap we have to fill. There's inflation, there's more people, there's more things we have to do. So yes, we need things we can do fairly quickly, which I think the gas fee is fairly quick. But I just want to point out, it's not just the gap we're having right now. That's the instant thing, but it's not going to go away once we fill that gap.
Yeah. Matt.
Thanks. So you just got me thinking about the land swap we did with the University of Oregon about a year ago. There was $1 million that was agreed upon for a future mutually agreeable project. I think it's somewhat nebulous, but I don't know what the deal points are around said project. And could we explore said project either to help fill some gaps or do some good around housing or climate I'd love a refresher about what those deal points actually were and if we could make that deal come to fruition in the near term.
So Councillor Keating, I would have to go back and look at the deal points too to remember exactly what they say. You are right that it is agreed that both the University of Oregon and the city council would have to agree on the use of that funding. The conversations that have, continued with the University of Oregon as we've been moving through that process of a land exchange has been centered on improvements in Alton Baker Park. Since that's really where that exchange is taking place, and the fact that the Alton Baker Park master planning process will be starting soon, and just thinking about how that funding could really help that area. So that's been the thinking to date. It wouldn't be able to be used for a one-time budget gap solve. I know that for pretty certain from the terms.
3 houses.
Yeah.
3 houses.
So I guess the summary of all of this is there's this, we're addressing the big stabilizing the city budget gap, but we still have all these additional work that we'd like to do and that we might have other funding streams, and we can come back and talk about those. And so we can do that in a focused way. Franchise fee, $1 million, all those pieces. So, okay. Any other questions or comments? Thank you very much. Very interesting conversation, and I'm hopeful about where this is going. So thank you. We are adjourned.